Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, Raise a Fly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. This is episode 7 of Sutton and Wall Street Trilogy, episode 7, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram, as well as support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals, and make sure to also check out my new Substack. All right, so let's begin where we left off. Germany and the United States struggle for Russian business. In 1918, such assistance to the embryonic Bolshevik regime was justified on the grounds of defeating Germany and inhibiting German exploitation of Russia. This was the argument used by W.B. Thompson and Raymond Robbins in sending Bolshevik revolutionaries and propaganda terms into Germany in 1918. The argument was also applied by Thompson in 1917 when conferring with Prime Minister Lloyd George about obtaining British support for the emerging Bolshevik regime. In June 1918, Ambassador Francis and his staff returned from Russia and urged President Wilson to, quote, recognize and aid the Soviet government of Russia. These reports made by the embassy staff at the State Department were leaked to the press and widely printed. Above all, it was claimed that delay in recognizing the Soviet Union would aid Germany and helps the German plan to foster reaction and counter-revolution. Exaggerated statistics were cited to support the proposal. For example, that the Soviet government represented 90% of the Russian people, and the other 10% is the former propertied and governing class. Naturally, they were displeased. A former American official was quoted as saying, if we do nothing, that is, if we just let things drift, we help weaken the Russian-Soviet government, and that plays Germany's game. So it was recommended that a commission armed with credit and good business advice could help much. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the economic situation had become critical, and inevitably of an embrace with capitalism dawned on the Communist Party and its planners. Lenin crystallized this awareness before the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Without the assistance of capital, it will be impossible for us to retain proletarian power in an incredibly ruined country in which the peasantry, also ruined, constitutes the overwhelming majority, and of course, for this assistance, capital will squeeze hundreds of % out of us. That is what we have to understand. Hence, either this type of economic relation or nothing. Then Leon Trotsky was quoted as saying, what we need here is an organizer like Bernard M. Baruch. Soviet awareness of its impending economic doom suggests that American and German business was attracted by the opportunity of exploiting the Russian market for needed goods. The Germans, in fact, made an early start in 1918. The first delays made by the Soviet Bureau in New York indicate that earlier American financial and moral support of the Bolsheviks was paying off in the form of contracts. The largest order in 1919-20 was contracted to Morris & Co. Chicago meatpackers for 50 million pounds of food products, valued at approximately $10 million. The Morris meatpacking family was related to the Swift family. Helen Swift, later connected with Abraham Lincoln Center Unity, was married to Edward Morris of the meatpacking firm and was also the brother of Harold H. Swift, a major in the 1917 Thompson Red Cross mission to Russia. Table contracts made in 1919 by the Soviet Bureau with U.S. firms. Ludwig Martins was formerly vice president of the Weinberg and Posner, located at 120 Broadway, New York City, and this firm was given a $3 million order. Soviet gold and American banks. Gold was the only practical means by which the Soviet Union could pay for its foreign purchases, and the international bankers were quite willing to facilitate Soviet gold shipments. Russian gold exports, primarily imperial gold coins, started in early 1920 to Norway and Sweden. These were transshipped to Holland and Germany for other world destinations, including the United States. In August 1920, a shipment of Russian gold coins was received at Den Norske Handelsbank in Norway as a guarantee for payment of 5,000 tons of coal by Niles Jewell and Company in the U.S. on behalf of the Soviet government. These coins were transferred to the Norges Bank for safekeeping. The coins were examined and weighed, were found to have been minted before the outbreak of the war in 1914, and were thus, therefore, genuine Imperial Russian coins. Shortly after this initial episode, the Robert Dollar Company of San Francisco received gold bars valued at 39 million Swedish kroner in its Stockholm account. the gold bore the stamp of the old Tsar government of Russia. The dollar company agent in Stockholm applied to American Express Company for facilities to ship the gold to the United States. American Express refused to handle the shipments. Robert Dollar, it should be noted, was the director of American International Company. Thus, AIC was linked to the first attempt at shipping gold direct to America. Simultaneously, it was reported that 3 ships had left Reval on the Baltic Sea with Soviet gold destined for the U.S. The SS Gotthard loaded 216 boxes of gold under the supervision of Professor Lomonosov, now returning to the United States. The SS Caroline loaded 216 boxes of gold under the supervision of 3 Russian agents. The SS Ruhelova was laden with 108 boxes of gold. Each box contained 3 poods of gold valued at 60,000 grand rubles each. This was followed by a shipment of the SS Wheeling Mold. Kuhn-Lev and Company, apparently acting in behalf of Guarantee Trust Company, then inquired of the State Department concerning the official attitude towards the receipt of Soviet gold. In a report, the department expressed concern because if acceptance was refused, then the gold would probably come back on the hands of the War Department, causing thereby direct government responsibility and increased embarrassment. The report, written by Merle Smith in conference with Kelly and Gilbert, argues that unless the professor has definite knowledge as to imperfect title, it would be impossible to refuse acceptance. It was anticipated that the U.S. would be requested to melt the gold in the SA office, and it was thereupon decided to telegraph Kuhn-Loeb and Company that no restrictions would be imposed on the importation of Soviet gold into the United States. The gold arrived at New York SA office and was deposited not by Cohen-Loeb and Company, but by Guarantee Trust Company of New York City. Guarantee Trust then inquired of the Federal Reserve Board, which in turn inquired of the U.S. Treasury concerning acceptance and payment. The superintendent of the New York SA office informed the Treasury that the approximately $7 million of gold had no identifying marks and that the bars deposited have already been melted in United States mint bars. The Treasury suggested that the Federal Reserve Board determine whether Guarantee Trust Company had acted for its own account or the account of another in presenting the gold, and particularly whether or not any transfer of gold, credit or exchange transaction has resulted from the importation of deposit of the gold. On November the 10th, 1920, A. Breton, a vice president of the Guarantee Trust, wrote to Assistant Secretary Gilbert of the Treasury Department, complaining that Guarantee had not received from the SA office the usual immediate advance against deposits of yellow metal left with them for reduction. The letter states that Guarantee Trust had received satisfactory assurances that the bars were the product of melting French and Belgian coins, although it had purchased the metal in Holland. The letter requested that the Treasury expedite payment for the gold. In reply, the Treasury argued that it does not purchase gold tender to the United States Mint or SA offices, which is known or suspected to be of Soviet origin. And in view of known Soviet sales of gold in Holland, the gold submitted by Guarantee Trust Company was held to be a doubtful case with suggestion of Soviet origin. It suggested that Guarantee Trust Company could withdraw the gold from the SA office at any time it wished, or could present such further evidence to the Treasury, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or the Department of State as may be necessary to clear the gold of any suspicion of Soviet origin. There was no file record concerning final deposition of this case, but presumably the Guarantee Trust Company was paid for the shipment. Obviously, this gold deposit was to implement the mid-1920 fiscal agreement between Guarantee Trust and Soviet government, under which the company became the Soviet agent in the United States, the epigraph to this chapter. It was determined at a later date that Soviet gold was also being sent to the Swedish Mint. The Swedish Mint melts Russian gold, assays it, and affixes the Swedish Mint stamp at the request of Swedish banks or other Swedish subjects owning the gold. And at the time, Olav Ashberg, head of Svenska Economy, AB, the Soviet intermediary and affiliate of Guarantee Trust, was offering unlimited quantities of Russian gold through Swedish banks. In brief, we can tie American International Corporation, the influential Professor Lomonosov, Guarantee Trust, and Olav Ashberg, whom we've previously identified, to the first attempts to import Soviet gold into the United States. Max May of Guarantee Trust becomes director of Roscombank. Guarantee Trust's interest in Russia was renewed in 1920 in the form of a letter from Henry C. Emery, assistant manager of the Foreign Department of Guarantee Trust, to DeWitt C. Poole in the State Department. The letter was dated January 21st, 1920, just a few weeks before Alan Walker, the manager of the Foreign Department, became active in forming the virulent anti-Soviet organization United Americans, see page 165. Emery posed numerous questions about the legal basis of the Soviet government and banking in Russia, and inquired whether the Soviet government was the de facto government in Russia. Revolt before 1922, planned by Reds, claimed United Americans in 1920 by Guarantee Trust had started negotiations with the same Reds and was acting as the Soviet agent in the U.S. in mid-1920. In January 1922, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover interceded with the State Department in behalf of a Guarantee Trust scheme to set up exchange relations with the new state bank at Moscow. The scheme, wrote Herbert Hoover, would not be objectionable if a stipulation were made that all monies coming into their possession should be used for the purchase of civilian commodities in the United States. And after asserting that such relations appeared to be in line with general policy, Hoover added, it might be advantageous to have these transactions organized in such a manner that we know what the movement is instead of disintegrated operations now current. Of course, such disintegrated operations are consistent with the operations of a free market, but this approach Herbert Hoover rejected in favor of channeling the exchange through specified and controlled sources in New York. Secretary of State Charles E. Hughes expressed a dislike of the Hoover Guarantee Trust scheme, which he thought could be regarded as a de facto recognition of the Soviets, while the foreign credits acquired might be used to the disadvantage of the United States. A non-committal reply was sent by State to Guarantee Trust. However, Guarantee went ahead with Herbert Hoover's support. Participation in formation of the first Soviet International Bank, and Max May of Guarantee Trust became head of the Foreign Department of the new Ruscom Bank. Okay. These are chapters are out of order. I don't think there's actually 10, so we'll just dispense with the numbering. J.P. Morgan gives a little help to the other side. I would not sit down to lunch with Morgan except possibly to learn something of his motives and attitudes. William E. Dodd, Ambassador Dodd's Diary, 1933 to 1938. So far, our story has revolved around a single major financial house, Guarantee Trust Company, the largest trust company in the United States, and controlled by the J.P. Morgan firm. Guarantee Trust used Olaf Oshberg, the Bolshevik banker, as its intermediary in Russia before and after the revolution. Guarantee Trust was a backer of Ludwig Martens and his Soviet Bureau, the first Soviet representatives in the United States, and in mid-1920s, Guarantee was the Soviet fiscal agent in the U.S. The first shipments of Soviet gold to the United States also traced back to Guarantee Trust. This is a startling reverse side to this pro-Bolshevik activity. Guarantee Trust was a founder of United Americans, a virulent anti-Soviet organization which noisily threatened Red invasion by 1922, claimed that 20 million of Soviet funds were on the way to fund Red Revolution, and forecast panic in the streets and massive starvation in New York City. This duplicity raises, of course, serious questions about the intent of Guarantee Trust and its directors. Dealing with the Soviets, even backing them, can be explained by apolitical greed or simply profit motive. On the other hand, spreading propaganda designed to create fear and panic while at the same time encouraging the conditions that gave rise to the fear and panic is considerably more a serious problem. It suggests utter moral depravity. Let's first look more closely at the anti-communist United Americans. So before we continue reading, this is actually a very interesting point that Sutton is mentioning. So he's mentioning this from the point of view that he can track the funds going both to the Bolsheviks and to this anti-Bolshevik organization. A theory I've been floating around on Twitter, largely from reading Sutton, is that consistent with what certain anarchists have said, such as Noam Chomsky, the Bolsheviks themselves were a coup against the legitimate, quote, legitimate socialist revolution of February led by Kerensky and company. That would make sense with the funding from Wall Street. Wall Street didn't want to see that happen. How else could you explain Wall Street undermining a friendly power fighting the Germans? The idea that the Bolsheviks were somehow going to fight the Germans is ludicrous, given that Lenin was sent to Russia by the Germans in order to get Russia out of the war. But what that would mean is that if the Kerensky regime represented something they considered a threat, something like actual socialism, if we want to use that word, that Bolshevism would be a bogeyman. That, oh, well, this is what socialism is, and you don't want Bolshevism. This also explains the rise of this United Americans, because now that they've created this bogeyman in the Soviets, they can then give voice to their own agents to identify that with socialism and then work against working class interests in the United States. So I'm not saying Sutton's wrong that it doesn't suggest utter, quote, moral depravity. I mean, it does, but it's also kind of brilliant from a diabolical perspective. And we'll see what conclusion Sutton comes to. United Americans formed to fight communism. In 1920, the organization United Americans was founded. It was limited to citizens of the United States and planned for 5 million members, whose sole purpose would be to combat the teachings of the socialist, communist, IWW, Russian organizations, and radical farmer societies. In other words, United Americans was to fight all those institutions and groups believed to be anti-capitalist. Well, there you go. That kind of proves my thesis right here. So that's also very interesting. The officers of the preliminary organization established to build up United Americans were Alan Walker of the Guarantee Trust Company, Daniel Willard, president of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, H. Westinghouse of Westinghouse Air Brake Company, Otto H. Kahn of Kahn, Loeb and Company, and American International Corporation. These Wall Streeters were backed up by assorted university presidents and Newton W. Gilbert, former governor of the Philippines. Obviously, United Americans was at first glance exactly the kind of organization that established capitalists would be expected to finance and join. Its formation should have brought no great surprise. On the other hand, as we have already seen, these financiers were also deeply involved in supporting the new Soviet regime in Russia, although this support was behind the scenes, recorded only in government files and not made public for 50 years. As part of United Americans, Walker, Willard, Westinghouse, and Kahn were playing a double game. Otto H. Kahn, a founder of the anti-communist organization, was reported by the British socialist J. H. Thomas as having his face towards the light. Kahn wrote the preface to Thomas's book. In 1924, Otto Kahn addressed the League for Industrial Democracy and professed common objectives with the activist socialist group. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Willard's employer, was active in the development of Russia during the 1920s. Westinghouse in 1920, the year United Americans was founded, and operating a plant in Russia that had been exempted from nationalization. And the role of Guarantee Trust has been minutely described. United Americans reveals startling disclosures on Reds. In March 1920, the New York Times headlined an extensive, detailed scare story about Red invasion of the United States within 2 years. An invasion which was to be financed by 20 millions of Soviet funds obtained by the murder and robbery of the Russian nobility. United Americans had, it was revealed, made a survey of radical activities in the United States, and had done so in its role as an organization formed to preserve the Constitution of the United States with representative form of government and the right of individual possession which the Constitution provides. Further, the survey, it was proclaimed, had the backing of the executive board, including Otto H. Kahn, Alan Walker of the Guarantee Trust Company, Daniel Willard, and others. The survey asserted that the radical leaders are confident of effecting a revolution within 2 years, that the start is to be made in New York City with a general strike, that Red leaders have predicted much bloodshed, that the Russian Soviet government has contributed $20 million to the American radical movement. The Soviet gold shipments to Guarantee Trust in mid-1920, 540 boxes of 3 poods each, were worth roughly $15 million at 20 a troy ounce. And other gold shipments through the Robert Dollar and Olaf Oshberg brought the total very close to $20 million. The information about Soviet gold for the radical movement was called thoroughly reliable and was being turned over to the government. The Reds, it was asserted, planned to starve New York into submission within 4 days. Meanwhile, the Reds count on a financial panic within the next few weeks to help their cause along. A panic would cause distress among the working men and thus render them more susceptible to revolution doctrine. The United Americans report grossly overstated the number of radicals in the United States, at first tossing around figures like 2 or 5 million, and then settling for precisely 3,465,000 members in 4 radical organizations. The report concluded by emphasizing the possibility of bloodshed and quoted Skazhewski, president of the International Publishing Association, otherwise the Communist Party, who boasted that the time was coming soon when the communists would destroy utterly the present form of society. In brief, United Americans published a report without substantiating evidence designed to scare the man on the street into panic. The significant point, of course, is that this is the same group that was responsible for protecting and subsidizing, indeed assisting, the Soviets so they could undertake these same plans. Okay. Conclusions concerning United Americans. In this case of the right hand not knowing what the left... Is this a case of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing? Probably not. We are talking about heads of companies, eminently successful companies at that. So United Americans was probably a ruse to divert public and official attention from the subterranean efforts made to gain entry into the Russian market. United Americans is the only documented example known to this writer of an organization assisting the Soviet regime and also in the forefront of opposition to the Soviets. This is by no means an inconsistent course of action, and further research should at least focus on the following aspects. Are there other examples of double dealing by influential groups generally known as the establishment? Can these examples be extended into other areas? For example, is there evidence that labor troubles have been instigated by these groups? What is the ultimate purpose of these pincer tactics? Can they be related to a Marxian axiom, thesis versus antithesis yield synthesis? It is a puzzle why the Marxist movement would attack capitalism head-on if its objective was a communist world and if it truly accepted the dialectic. If the objective is a communist world, that is, if communism is the desired synthesis and capitalism is the thesis, then something apart from capitalism or communism has to be the antithesis. Could therefore capitalism be the antithesis? Could therefore capitalism be the thesis and communism the antithesis, with the objective of the revolutionary groups and their backers being a synthesizing of the two systems into some world system yet unsubscribed? Right here is the answer. And the world system is the scientific dictatorship, which is recorded by H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Aldous Huxley, and C.S. Lewis, which, from our vantage point of not yet having the scientific dictatorship, would have elements of capitalism and communism, but both of whom seek to have a scientific, ordered society. So I think right here, Sutton really is hitting the nail on the head. The fact that he doesn't go further, at least not here, is partly the fact that all of this evidence that's been spread all over the place is not easy to come by. And in fact, the research he did for his Soviet technical transfer trilogy itself was a Herculean effort. So I'm not blaming him for not putting all the pieces together. And in fact, it's his research which has been very helpful in me putting the pieces together. Morgan and Rockefeller aid Kolchak. Concurrently with these efforts to aid the Soviet Bureau and United Americans, the J.P. Morgan firm, which controlled Guarantee Trust, was providing financial assistance for one of the Bolsheviks' primary opponents, Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia. On June 23, 1919, Congressman Mason introduced House Resolution 132, instructing the State Department to make inquiry to all, in singular, as to the truth of press reports, charging that Russian bondholders had used their influence to bring about the retention of American troops in Russia in order to ensure continued payment of interest on Russian bonds. According to a file memorandum by Basil Myers, an associate of William F. Sands, Congressman Mason charged that certain banks were attempting to secure recognition of Admiral Kolchak in Siberia to get payment on former Russian bonds. Then in August 1919, the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, received from the Rockefeller-influenced National City Bank of New York a letter requesting official comment on a proposed loan of $5 million to Admiral Kolchak. And from J.P. Morgan & Co. and other bankers, another letter requesting the views of the department concerning an additional proposed £10 million sterling loan to Kolchak by a consortium of British and American bankers. Secretary Lansing informed the bankers that the United States had not recognized Kolchak, and although prepared to render him assistance, the State Department did not feel it could assume the responsibility of encouraging such negotiations, but that nevertheless there seemed to be no objection to the loan, provided the bankers deemed it advisable to make it. Subsequently, on September 30th, Lansing informed the American Consul General at Omsk that the loan has since gone through in regular course. 2/5 were taken up by British banks and 3/5 by American banks. 2/3 of the total was to be spent in Britain and the United States, and the remaining 1/3 wherever the Kolchak government wished. The loan was secured by Russian gold, Kolchaks, that was shipped to San Francisco. The timing of the previously described Soviet exports of gold suggests a cooperation with the Soviets on gold sales were determined on the heels of the Kolchak gold loan agreement. Well, again, what's interesting here, too, is it looks like this whole operation was just to plunder Russia's gold reserves. If you're getting gold from the Bolsheviks, you're getting gold from Kolchak. By the time you're all done with this, Russia has no gold left over. So it seems like part of this broader plan, besides funding both sides, was to deplete Russia's gold supplies, which in the age of the gold standard, which we didn't get off on until domestically until FDR, and internationally until Nixon, would have been a severe handicap for whoever took over Russia in the future. The Soviet gold sales and the Kolchak loan also suggest that Carroll Quigley's statement that Morgan interests infiltrated the domestic left applied also to overseas revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements. Yep. Summer 1919 was a time of Soviet military reverses in Crimea and the Ukraine, and this black picture may have induced British and American bankers to mend their fences with the anti-Bolshevik forces. The obvious rationale would be to have a foot in all camps and so be in a favorable position to negotiate for concessions in business after the revolution or counter-revolution had succeeded and a new government stabilized. As the outcome of any conflict cannot have been at the start, the idea is to place sizable bets on all horses in a revolutionary race. This assistance was given on the one hand to the Soviets and on the other to Kolchak, while the British government was supporting Denikin in the Ukraine, and the French government went to the aid of the Poles. In autumn of 1919, the Berlin newspaper Berliner Zeitung am Mittag, October 8th and 9th, accused the Morgan firm of financing the West Russian government and the Russian-German forces in the Baltic fighting the Bolsheviks, both allied to Kolchak. The Morgan firm strenuously denied the charge. This firm has had no discussion or meeting with West Russian government or with anyone pretending to represent it at any time. But if the financing charge was inaccurate, there is evidence of collaboration, documents found by Latvian government intelligence among the papers of Colonel Bermondant, commander of the Western Volunteer Army, confirmed the relations claimed existed between Kolchak's London agent and the German industrial ring, which was backed by Bermond. In other words, we know that J.P. Morgan, London, and New York bankers financed Kolchak. There was also evidence that connects Kolchak and his army with other anti-Bolshevik armies. And there seems to be little question that German industrial and banking circles were financing the all-Russian anti-Bolshevik army in the Baltic. Obviously, bankers' feuds have no national flag. The alliance of bankers and revolution. The name Rockefeller does not connote a revolutionary, and my life situation has fostered a careful and continuous attitude that verges on conservatism. I am not given to errant causes. John D. Rockefeller III, the Second American Revolution. The evidence presented, a synopsis. Evidence has been published by George Katkov, Stefan Posny, and Michael Futrell, has established that the return to Russia of Lenin and his party of exiled Bolsheviks, followed a few weeks later by a party of Mensheviks, was financed and organized by the German government. The necessary funds were transferred in part through the Naya Banken in Stockholm, owned by Olaf Aschberg, and the dual German objectives were A, removal of Russia from the war, and B, control of post-Russian market. Well, exactly, which again, any Wall Street supporter of the Bolsheviks at the expense of Kerensky would have taken Russia out of the war, because that was the entire point of the Bolsheviks. So Thompson was lying when he said that the Bolsheviks would fight the Germans. But then the question is, why was he lying? And I think we might get some answers here from Sutton. We have now gone beyond this evidence to establish a continuing working relationship between Bolshevik banker Olaf Aschberg and the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust Company in New York before, during, and after the Russian Revolution. In Tsarist times, Aschberg was the Morgan agent in Russia and negotiator for Russian loans in the United States. During 1917, Aschberg was a financial intermediary for the revolutionaries. And after the revolution, Aschberg became head of Ruscombank, the first Soviet international bank, while Max Maya, vice president of the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust, became director-in-chief of the Ruscombank Foreign Department. We have presented documentary evidence of continuing working relationship between the Guarantee Trust Company and the Bolsheviks. The directors of Guarantee Trust in 1917 are listed in Appendix 1. Moreover, there is evidence of transfers of funds from Wall Street bankers to international revolutionary activities. For example, there is the statement, substantiated by a cablegram by William Boyce Thompson, the director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a large stockholder in the Rockefeller-controlled Chase Bank, and a financial associate of the Guggenheims and the Morgans, that he, Thompson, contributed $1 million to the Bolshevik Revolution for propaganda purposes. Another example is John Reed, the American member of the Third International Executive Committee, who was financed and supported by Eugene Boissevin, a private New York banker, and who was employed by Harry Payne Whitney's Metropolitan magazine. Whitney was at the time a director of Guarantee Trust. We also established that Ludwig Martens, the first Soviet ambassador to the United States, was, according to British intelligence chief Sir Basil Thomson, backed by funds from Guarantee Trust Company. In tracing Trotsky's funding in the U.S., we arrived at German sources, yet to be identified in New York. And although we do not know the precise German sources of Trotsky's funds, we do know that von Pavensted, the chief German espionage paymaster in the United States, was also a senior partner of Amsnick & Co. Amsnick was owned by the ever-present American International Corporation, also controlled by the J.P. Morgan firm. Further, Wall Street firms, included Guarantee Trust, were involved with Carranza and Vila's wartime revolutionary activities in Mexico. We also identified documentary evidence concerning a Wall Street syndicate's financing of the 1912 Sun Yat-sen Revolution in China, a revolution that is today hailed by the Chinese Communists as a precursor of Mao's revolution in China. Charles B. Hill, New York attorney negotiating with Sun Yat-sen on behalf of his syndicate, was the director of 3 Westinghouse subsidiaries, and we have found that Charles R. Crane of Westinghouse in Russia was involved in the Russian Revolution. Quite apart from finance, we identified other and possibly more significant evidence of a Wall Street involvement in the Bolshevik case. The American Red Cross mission to Russia was a private venture of William B. Thompson, who publicly offered partisan support to the Bolsheviks. British War Cabinet papers now available record that British policy was diverted towards the Lenin-Trotsky regime by the personal intervention of Thompson with Lloyd George in December 1917. We have reproduced statements by Director Thompson and Deputy Chairman William Lawrence Saunders, both of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, strongly favoring the Bolsheviks. John Reed not only was financed from Wall Street, but had consistent support for his activities, even to the extent of intervention with State Department from William Franklin Sands, Executive Secretary of American International Corporation. In the sedition case of Robert Minor, there are strong indications and some circumstantial evidence that Colonel Edward House intervened to have Minor released. The significance of the Minor case is that William B. Thompson's program for Bolshevik Revolution in Germany was the very program Minor was implementing when arrested in Germany. Some international agents, for example, Alexander Gumberg, worked for Wall Street and the Bolsheviks. In 1917, Gumberg was the representative of a U.S. firm in Petrograd, worked for Thompson's American Red Cross mission, became chief Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia until he was deported from Norway, then became confidential assistant to Reeve Shelley of Chase Bank in New York, and later to Floyd Odium of Atlas Corporation. The activity on behalf of the Bolsheviks originated in large part from a single address, 120 Broadway Street, New York City. The evidence of this observation is outlined, but no conclusive reason is given for the unusual concentration of activity at a single address, except to state that it appears to be the foreign counterpart of Carroll Quigley's claim that J.P. Morgan infiltrated the domestic left. Morgan also infiltrated the international left. This paragraph right here is extremely important in that a lot of the 20th century that doesn't really make sense makes sense now, because the socialist left, as it was developing within the early 20th century, was considered a serious threat to global capitalism. And both at home and abroad, they sought to create what are called counter gangs. So, for example, I had Caleb Maupin on a couple times already to discuss his book, How Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, and he points out that they create counter gangs to disrupt and dilute the left. But what Caleb Maupin doesn't understand is that the Bolsheviks themselves were a counter gang to disrupt the authentic People's Revolution of February. And then there were various infiltrations within the United States itself to undermine any sort of credible socialist threat. And then these two groups were then pitted against each other as a pro-communist, anti-communist, or pro-Soviet, anti-Soviet. And one of the things that he points out correctly is that the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which gave rise to the 1960s and all the culture stuff, was a sort of domestic controlled opposition left going after the Bolshevik left, which Stalin tried to break away from. I'll talk about more of this later sometime this month. I'm still working on tying all these ideas together. But there's going to be an interesting video in not too long where I discuss what I consider to be the true arc of the 20th century. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was at 120 Broadway. The vehicle for this pro-Bolshevik activity was American International Corporation at 120 Broadway. AIC views on the Bolshevik regime was requested by Secretary of State Lansing only a few weeks after the revolution began, and Sands, executive secretary of AIC, could barely restrain his enthusiasm for the Bolshevik cause. Ludwig Martens, the Soviet's first ambassador, had been vice president of Weinberg and Posner, which was also located at 120 Broadway. Guarantee Trust Company was next door at 140 Broadway, but Guarantee Securities Co. was at 120 Broadway. In 1917, Hunt, Hill, and Betts was at 120 Broadway, and Charles B. Hill of this firm was the negotiator in the Sun Yat-sen dealings. John McGregor Grant Co., which was financed by Olaf Ashberg in Sweden and Guarantee Trust in the United States, and which was on the military intelligence blacklist, was at 120 Broadway. The Guggenheims and the executive heart of General Electric, also interested in American International, were at 120 Broadway. We find it therefore hardly surprising that the Bankers Club was at 120 Broadway, on the top floor, the 34th floor. See, that's interesting, right? Because according to the inside, the 33rd, there's actually a degree higher than the 33rd degree Freemason, the 34th degree. And if he's right, that's certainly not an accident that it's on the 34th floor. It is significant that support for the Bolsheviks did not cease with the consolidation of revolution. Therefore, this support cannot be wholly explained in terms of the war with Germany. Well, nor could it be explained because by taking Russia out of the war, Germany now has a free hand to invade France. Unless we all forget, the Michael offensive in the spring of 1918 almost won. They almost took Paris. So they're playing a very dangerous game here. If Russia had not dropped out of the war, Operation Michael never would have happened, and the Germans wouldn't have got close to Paris. As closer than they did in 1914. So again, this is a dangerous game. Germany almost won in 1918. The American-Russian syndicate formed in 1918 to obtain concessions in Russia was backed by White, Guggenheim, and Sinclair interests. Director of companies controlled by these three financiers include Thomas W. Lamont, Guarantee Trust, William Boyce Thompson, Federal Reserve Bank, and John Reed's employer, Harry Payne Whitney, Guarantee Trust. This strongly suggested the syndicate was formed to cash in on earlier support for the Bolshevik cause and the revolutionary period. And then we found that Guarantee Trust financially backed the Soviet Bureau in New York in 1919. The first really concrete signal that previous political and financial support was paying off came in 1923 when the Soviets formed their first international bank, Ruscombank. Morgan associate Olaf Ashberg became nominal head of the Soviet bank. Max May, a vice president of Guarantee Trust, became a director of Ruscombank, and the Ruscombank promptly appointed Guarantee Trust Company its U.S. agent. Okay. The explanation for the unholy alliance. What motive explains the coalition of capitalists and Bolsheviks? Russia was then and is today the largest untapped market in the world. Moreover, Russia then and now constituted the greatest potential competitive threat to American industrial financial supremacy. A glance at a world map is significant. It is sufficient to spotlight the geopolitical difference between the vast landmass of Russia and the smaller United States. Wall Street must have cold shivers when it visualizes Russia as a second super American industrial giant. But why allow Russia to become a competitor and a challenge to U.S. supremacy? In the late 19th century, Morgan, Rockefeller, and Guggenheim had demonstrated their monopolistic proclivities. In Railroads and Regulations, 1877-1916, Gabriel Coco has demonstrated how the railroad owners, not the farmers, wanted state control of railroads in order to preserve their monopoly and abolish competition. So the simplest explanation of our evidence is that the syndicate of Wall Street financiers enlarged their monopoly ambitions and broadened horizons on a global scale. The gigantic Russian market was to become converted into a captive market and a technical colony to be exploited by a few high-powered American financiers and the corporations under their control. What the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Federal Trade Commission under the thumb of American industry could achieve for that industry at home, a planned socialist government could be achieved for it abroad, given suitable support and inducements from Wall Street and Washington, D.C. Finally, lest this explanation seem too radical, remember that it was Trotsky who appointed Tsar's generals to consolidate the Red Army, that it was Trotsky who appealed for American officers to control revolutionary Russia and intervene on behalf of the Soviets, that it was Trotsky who squashed first the libertarian element in the Russian Revolution and then workers and peasants, and that recorded historically ignores the 700,000-man Green Army composed of ex-Bolsheviks angered at a betrayal of the revolution, who fought the whites and the reds. In other words, we are suggesting that the Bolshevik Revolution was an alliance of statist revolutionaries and statist financiers against the genuine revolutionary libertarian elements in Russia. The one thing that I'll add here is Sutton is kind of right and kind of wrong when he talks about libertarian elements in Russia. The elements that consolidated around Kerensky were libertarian in the sense of anti-statist, but they certainly weren't pro-capitalist. They were still socialist. That's what people like Chomsky and other anarchists would call libertarian or left socialism or left anarchism. Not that Kerensky was an anarchist, but it was more, quote, direct democratics. That's what guys we call democratic socialism. You have all these Soviets, the workers and the councils and the sailors and the soldiers. But even so, that would still be a lot better than the Bolshevik monstrosity that developed afterwards. The question now in the reader's minds must be, were these bankers also secret Bolsheviks? No, of course not. The financiers were without ideology. It would be a gross misinterpretation to assume that assistance for the Bolsheviks was ideologically motivated in any narrow sense. The financiers were power motivated and therefore assisted any political vehicle that would give them an entry to power. Trotsky, Lenin, the Tsar, Kolchak, Denikin all received aid more or less. All, that is, but those who wanted a truly free individualist society. Okay, the other thing I'll add here, which is outside the scope of this essay, is if you read the excellent book Revolution of Above by Kerry Bolton, the so-called support that was given to Kolchak was not really support. Kolchak reported that he never got the armaments that he paid for. So when Tukhachevsky in 1920 marches in with the Red Army, Kolchak's troops are undergunned and undersupported. Maybe Sutton didn't know about that. Again, he's already done a ton of research, so I'm not being too critical here. He's given us a lot to work with. But they didn't support Kolchak equally. And we see this also with the nationalists in the 40s. They also received, quote, aid, purchased aid, but never got it. Wiedemeyer reports that many nationalist Chinese forces were without ammunition, even though they paid for it. So again, a lot of this was robbery. They gave money to Wall Street, but didn't get what they paid for. So Wall Street put their thumbs on the scale to make sure that the Reds won in both Russia and China, which is something at least here Sutton does not seem to be aware of. Neither was aid restricted to statist Bolsheviks and statist counter-Bolsheviks. J.P.D. Higgins and Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America, has noted, regarding Thomas Lamont of Guaranteed Trust, that of all American business leaders, the one who most vigorously patronized the cause of fascism was Thomas W. Lamont, head of the powerful J.P. Morgan banking network. Lamont served as something of a business consultant for the government of fascist Italy. Lamont secured a $100 million loan for Mussolini in 1926, a particularly crucial time for the Italian dictator. We might remember, too, the director of Guaranteed Trust was the father of Coriolis Lamont, a domestic communist. This even-handed approach to the twin totalitarian systems, communism and fascism, was not confined to the Lamont family. For example, Otto Kahn, director of American International Corporation and of Cohen and Loeb and Company, felt sure that American capital investment in Italy will find safety, encouragement, and opportunity and reward. This is the same Otto Kahn who lectured the Socialist League of Industrial Democracy in 1924 that its objectives were his objectives. They differed only, according to Otto Kahn, over the means of achieving these objectives. Ivy Lee, Rockefeller's public relations man, made similar pronouncements and was responsible for selling the Soviet regime to the gullible American public in the 1920s. We also observe that Basil Miles, in charge of the Russian desk at the State Department and a former associate of William Franklin Sands, was decidedly helpful to the businessmen promoting Bolshevik causes. But in 1923, the same Miles authored a pro-fascist article, Italy's Black Shirts in Business. Success of the fascists is an expression of Italy's youth, wrote Miles, while glorifying the fascist movement and applauding its esteem for American business. All right, I think we can also fit in the Marburg Plan. The Marburg Plan, financed by Andrew Carnegie's ample heritage, was produced in the early years of the 20th century. It suggests a premeditation for this kind of superficial schizophrenia, which in fact masks an integrated program for power acquisition. What then if Carnegie and his unlimited wealth, the international financiers, and the socialists could be organized in a movement to compel the formation of a league to enforce peace? The governments of the world, according to the Marburg Plan, were to be socialized, while the ultimate power would remain in the hands of international financiers to control its councils and enforce peace, and so provide a specific for all the political ills of mankind. This idea was knit with other elements with similar objectives. Lord Milner in England provides a transatlantic example of banking interests recognizing the virtues and possibilities of Marxism. Milner was a banker, influential in British wartime policy and pro-Marxist. In New York, the Socialist X Club was founded in 1903. It counted among its members not only the communist Lincoln Steffens, the socialist William English Walling, and the communist banker Morris Hillquit, but also John Dewey, James T. Shotwell, Charles Edward Russell, and Rufus Weeks. The annual meeting of the Economic Club in the Astor Hotel, New York, witnessed socialist speakers. In 1918, when A. Barton Hepburn, president of Chase National Bank, was president of the Economic Club, the main speaker was the aforementioned Morris Hillquit, who had abundant opportunity to preach socialism to a gathering which represented wealth and financial interests. From this unlikely seed grew the modern internationalist movement, which included not only the financiers, Carnegie, Paul Warburg, Otto Kahn, Bernard Baruch, and Herbert Hoover, but also the Carnegie Foundation and its progeny International Conciliation. The trustees of Carnegie were, as we have seen, prominent on the board of American International Corporation. In 1910, Carnegie donated $10 million to found the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and among those on the board of trustees were L.I. Root, mission to Russia in 1917, Cleveland H. Hodge, a financial backer of President Wilson, George W. Perkins, Morgan partner, G. J. Bulk, AIC and Amsnick, R. F. Herrick, AIC, H.W. Pritchett, AIC, and other Wall Street luminaries. Woodrow Wilson came under the powerful influence of, and indeed was financially indebted to, this group of internationalists. As Jennings C. Wise has written, historians must never forget that Woodrow Wilson made it possible for Leon Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport. But Leon Trotsky also declared himself an internationalist. We have remarked with some interest his high-level internationalist connections, or at least friends in Canada. Trotsky then was not pro-Russian or pro-Allied or pro-German, as many have tried to make him out to be. Trotsky was for world revolution, for world dictatorship. He was, in one word, an internationalist. Bolsheviks and bankers have this significant common ground, internationalism. Revolution and international finance are not at all inconsistent if the result of revolution is to establish more centralized authority. Central international finance prefers to deal with central governments. The last thing the banking community wants is laissez-faire economy and decentralized power, because this would disperse power. This, therefore, is an explanation that fits the evidence. This handful of bankers and promoters was not Bolshevik or communist or socialist or Democrat or even American. Above all else, these men wanted markets, preferably captive international markets, and a monopoly of the captive world market as the ultimate goal. They wanted markets that could be exploited monopolistically without fear of competition from Russians, Germans, or anyone else, including American businessmen outside the charm circle. This closed group was apolitical and amoral. In 1970, it had a single-minded objective, a captive market in Russia, all presented under and intellectually protected by the shelter of a league to enforce the peace. Wall Street did indeed achieve its goal. American firms controlled by this syndicate were later to go on and build the Soviet Union, and today are well on their way to bringing the Soviet military-industrial complex into the age of the computer. Today, this objective is still alive and well, and John D. Rockefeller expounds it in his book, The Second American Revolution, which sports a 5-pointed star on the title page. The book contains a naked plea for humanism, that is, a plea that our first priority is to work for others. In other words, a plea for collectivism. Humanism is collectivism. It is notable that the Rockefellers, who have promoted this humanistic ideal for a century, have not turned their own property over to the others. Presumably, it is implicit in their recommendation that we all work for the Rockefellers. Rockefeller's book promotes collectivism under the guises of cautious conservatism and the public good. It is an effective plea for the continuation of the earlier Morgan Rockefeller support of collectivist enterprise and mass subversion of individual rights. In brief, the public good has been and is today used as a device and an excuse for self-aggrandizing by an elite circle that pleads for world peace and human decency. But so long as the reader looks at world history in terms of an inexorable Marxian conflict between capitalism and communism, the objectives of such an alliance between international finance and international revolution remain elusive. So will the ludicrousy of promotion of the public good by plunderers. If these alliances still elude the reader, then he should ponder the obvious fact that the same international interests and promoters are always willing to determine what other people should do, but are signally unwilling to be first in line to give up their own wealth and power. Their mouths are open and their pockets are closed. This technique used by the monopolists to gouge society was set forth in the early 20th century by Frederick C. Howe in Confessions of a Monopolist. First, says Howe, politics is a necessary part of business. To control industries, it is necessary to control Congress and the regulators, and thus make society go to work for you, the monopolist. So according to Howe, the two principles of a successful monopolist are first, let society work for you, and second, make business of politics. These, wrote Howe, are the basic rules of big business. Is there any evidence that this magnificently sweeping objective was known to Congress and the academic world? Certainly the possibility was known publicly. For example, witness the testimony of Albert Rise Williams, an astute commentator on the Revolution, before the Senate Overman Committee. It is probably true that under the Soviet government, industrial life will perhaps be much slower in development than under those usual capitalistic system. But why should a great industrial country like America desire the creation and consequent competition of another great industrial rival? Are not the interests of America in this regard in line with the slow tempo of development which Soviet Russia projects for herself? Senator Wolcott. Then your argument is that it would be to the interest of America to have Russia repressed. Mr. Williams, not repressed. Senator Wolcott, you say, why should America desire Russia to become an industrial competitor with her? Mr. Williams, this is speaking from a capitalist standpoint. The whole interest of America is not, I think, to have another great industrial rival like Germany, England, France, and Italy thrown on the market in competition. I think other government over there besides the Soviet government would perhaps increase the tempo of rate of development of Russia and would have been another rival. Of course, this is arguing from the capitalist standpoint. Senator Wolcott, so you are presenting an argument here which you think might appeal to the American people. Your point being this, that if we recognize the Soviet government of Russia as it is constituted, we will be recognizing the government that cannot compete with us in industry for a great many years. Mr. Williams, that is a fact. Wow. Wow. Senator Wolcott, this is an argument that under the Soviet government, Russia is in no position for a great many years at least to approach America industrially. Mr. Williams, absolutely. And in that forthright statement by Albert Rise Williams is the basic clue to the revisionist interpretation of Russian history over the past half century. Wall Street, or rather the Morgan Rockefeller complex, represented at 120 Broadway and 14 Wall Street, has something very close to Williams' argument in mind. Wall Street went to bat in Washington for the Bolsheviks that succeeded. The Soviet totalitarian regime survived. In the 1930s, foreign firms, mostly of the Morgan Rockefeller Group, built the five-year plans. They have continued to build Russia economically and militarily. On the other hand, Wall Street presumably did not foresee the Korean War and Vietnam War, in which 100,000 Americans and countless allies lost their lives to Soviet armaments built with the same imported U.S. technology. What seems a far-sighted and undoubtedly profitable policy for a Wall Street syndicate became a nightmare for millions outside the elitist power circle and the ruling class. The only thing I'll have to say here is while the evidence and the actual connection of the evidence into this broader monopolistic conspiracy is correct, I believe broadly correct, two, I think there's a couple glaring flaws with the overall ideology Sutton is espousing. Nobody in Russia was anything like the libertarians in the United States in the Russian Revolution. The Greens or even the non-Bolshevik socialists who were behind the first February Revolution, certainly didn't believe in a military despotism like Lenin imposed, but neither were they free market libertarians. Hardly anything like that even existed in Russia. So that's just, I think, an unfortunate projection of his American context. Second of all, it's fairly clear that whatever we want to say about the socialism that predated Bolshevism, it was perceived as such a sufficient threat that it had to be infiltrated on both fronts, domestically and internationally. Such that the face of socialism abroad was Bolshevism, the thing that Chomsky complained about in the 80s. So clearly it was perceived to be a genuine threat to their system. And the laissez-faire system that they evolved out of in the 1860s and then created monopolistic control of in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Bank indicates that whatever that system was, the sort of like between the two banks, basically, between Jackson and Wilson, which is the sort of like laissez-faire paradise that many libertarians and conservatives think about, gave rise to this. Not only did it give rise to this, because all of these oligarchs of finance grew out of this, they then in secret produced all of these control mechanisms that the petite bourgeoisie were completely unable to even comprehend, let alone fight. So I don't really see how this is a winning strategy. But that aside, the fact that he gave us all these arguments that we can then stitch together, also the fact that he doesn't seem to be aware of the technological dictatorship. I mean, obviously, we have H.G. Wells. He should be relatively well known. Certainly Brave New World should be well known. And C.S. Lewis. But again, I think Sutton is a big part of the answer, though not the entire answer. I think the best description of what we have to deal with is Revolution from Above by Kerry Bolton, who is himself indebted to Sutton. So again, it's an important contribution, even if it's not all the parts that we need. Okay, we're in the appendices now. We're in the home stretch, everybody. Now we're going to check out the chat. Denwell, hello. Mass Production Creations, hello. Let's see. Minoan, mind blown. That's 35 minutes. I'm trying to figure out where your mind was blown. Bankers Club is on the top roof terrace. Oh, that's it. Yeah, 34. Yeah. Let's see. Hello, Fun Smart. All right, everybody. That's about the end of the hour. We're in the home stretch. We'll get to the appendices and wrap up Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution over the next few weeks. So this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.